They said the lame midwife would be dead by spring. The Duke of Kelmore said it too, softly, the way a man remarks that rain is likely, when he wed her in a cold chapel to cheat his cousin of the entail, and then carried her off to a rotting stud farm to die where no one would have to watch. He gave her a purse that weighed almost nothing, and a cold word of parting, and he rode away at dawn without once looking back. He did not expect word of her to reach him 3 years later. He did not expect the king's own racehorses to be stabled under her name. He did not expect to ride home to seize worthless land and find, standing square in the ruin he had abandoned, the one thing all his money and all his rank could never buy back. This is the story of the wife a duke threw away, and the winter she refused to lie down in the dark, and the long, slow reckoning of the man who came home to bury her and found her waiting instead. The chapel at Kelmore was not warm, and no one had troubled to make it so. Adela Holt stood at the rail with her weight braced on her sound leg, because the ruined hip would not bear a full hour of standing, and she had learned long ago that pride was a coin you spent carefully or not at all. She wore her own grey wool. No one had offered her anything better, and she had not asked. The candles had been lit late and grudgingly, and the curate spoke the words of the marriage service in the flat hurry of a man reading out a bill of lading, glancing twice at the door as though he had somewhere warmer to be. Beside her stood a man she had met exactly twice. Rafe Sutcliffe, 6th Duke of Kelmore, was tall and still and dressed in dark blue that had cost more than her cottage, and he looked at the altar rather than at her, as though the ceremony were a document he was signing, and she the ink it was signed in. He had a handsome, closed face, the kind that had learned young that softness was a leak in the hull, and no expression crossed it at all. When the curate asked whether he would take this woman, his voice was even and unhurried. When the curate asked her the same, she answered clearly, because she would not give the 2 hired witnesses the pleasure of watching her falter. There was a cousin present, and she understood the whole of the business the moment she saw him. Hugo Sutcliffe leaned against the far pillar with a smile that never once climbed above his mouth, and Adela grasped, without being told, that she existed to spite that smile. The old Duke's will had bound the entailed estates about with one hard condition, that his heir must take a lawful wife before his 35th birthday, or forfeit the whole of the entailed land to the next man in blood. Rafe's 35th birthday stood a bare fortnight off, and Hugo, who was that next man in blood, had already lodged his petition to take everything the very hour the day passed, with the Duke still unwed. But the condition, once met, was met past all undoing. Let Rafe be lawfully married, but a single day before the date, and the land was his for good, and his cousin's petition fell to dust, and no later widowing could ever revive it, for a man who has once been a lawful husband has satisfied the terms, though his wife lie cold in her grave the week after the wedding. Only one thing on earth could unmake it now, a marriage proven to have been no marriage at all, void from its very first hour. So Rafe had gone looking for a bride no one would question, and no one would grieve. A village midwife with a wrecked hip and no family living, a woman the physicians had privately assured him carried a weakness of the blood that would see her in the ground inside the 12-month, a wife who would meet the condition, secure the land forever, and then, conveniently and naturally, die, leaving him a widower in quiet and unassailable possession, with no living duchess to trouble his house and no way left in law for his cousin to touch the land. She knew all of it. She had been told most of it plainly, which she supposed was a species of honesty. A Sutcliffe attorney had come to her cottage a fortnight before with a paper and a purse and a proposition, and he had not pretended it was anything but what it was. Marry the Duke, be a duchess in name only, retire to the country, trouble no one, and let the country do the rest. She had asked what she should live on, and the attorney had said the estate would provide, and something in the way his eyes slid to the window when he said it had told her the estate would provide precisely nothing. She had signed anyway, and she had signed with a steady hand. A woman with a limp and no husband and no father living grew old very fast in a village, and the village had already begun to look at her the way one looks at a chair that will soon want mending, and is not quite worth the trouble. She had brought half the children of 3 parishes into the world with these 2 hands. She had knelt in more blood and candlelight than she could count, had turned babies that would not come and coaxed breath into infants that lay blue and silent, and had watched afterward the very mothers she saved cross the lane to avoid the sight of her when their own luck turned, and they wanted no reminder of how close a thing living was. She was 1:30. She had decided that if she was to be used, she would at the least be paid for it, and she would decide for herself what the price had bought. "You may kiss," the curate said, without conviction. Rafe turned to her. For one moment their eyes met, and she saw in his not cruelty, which she could have understood, but something colder and more complete, a courteous, total absence, the look a man gives a room he is leaving for the last time, and does not expect to think of again. He bent and pressed his lips, dry and brief, to her cheek. He smelled of cold air and good leather and nothing human. Then he straightened, and the moment was finished, and she was a duchess. They did not stay the night at Kelmore. That, too, she had expected. The carriage went east through a grey and shortening afternoon, and Rafe rode ahead on a tall grey horse, keeping always a careful distance from the carriage door, as though the vehicle carried something whose air he preferred not to share. Adela watched the country change through the street glass. The soft green hills gave way to flat heath, to long open runs of turf and gorse, to the great pale sky of the horse country where the light comes down without a hill to break it. She knew where they were bound now. Everyone in England knew the name of Newmarket, where kings kept their bloodstock, and a fortunes turned on the length of a horse's nose. But they did not stop in the town. They turned off a mile short of it, down a rutted lane between fences that had gone to gaps and rot, and came at last, as the light drained out of the west, to a place whose gate hung from a single hinge, and whose name, worn nearly off the post, was Cold Harbour. She had been prepared for a farm. She had not been prepared for a grave that had not yet finished being dug. The great barn had lost half its roof, and the bared rafters stood black against the last of the sky like the ribs of something large that had died on its side and been left. The carriage lurched to a halt and pitched her against the door. The wheels grinding down into mud churned and frozen and churned again into ruts a man could turn an ankle in, and somewhere behind the buildings a dog barked once and thought better of it. She steadied herself and looked out. Along the range of loose boxes, even in the failing light, she could make out the shapes of horses that no horse should be. Hip bones sharp as gateposts, coats staring and dull, heads hung low to the door. Beyond them the house waited, a square dark block with 3 of its shutters gone, and a look of having given up. Rafe swung down from the grey and handed it off to a boy who came running out of the dark, and Adela, who had spent her life watching bodies tell the truths their owners hid, noted that he handed the horse away quickly, and stepped back from it quickly and turned his shoulder to it the moment he decently could. An old man came out of the barn wiping his hands on a sacking apron. He was bent and weathered, with white stubble on a hard jaw, and eyes gone pale with years, and he looked at the carriage and at the Duke, and at the woman being helped down the step, with the flat unsurprise of a man who had stopped expecting good news a long time ago, and had made his peace with the arrangement. "Wren," Rafe said, "this is the Duchess. She will be residing here." The old man's pale eyes moved to Adela. She watched him take in the limp, the plain grey wool, the years on her, and reach his own conclusions, and she watched him be too tired or too courteous to say them aloud. "Your Grace," he said, to the frozen mud between them. Rafe did not go into the house. He did not, in the end, stay above a quarter of an hour. He gave certain low instructions to the old man that Adela was not meant to hear, and he took from his saddlebag a small purse and put it into her cold hand, and it weighed, as she had known it would, almost nothing at all. "There is enough there for immediate needs," he said. "The property is yours to occupy as you see fit. I will not trouble you, madam, and I will ask that you not trouble me. Live quietly. It is all I require of you." She looked up at him. The east wind pulled at his dark coat and did not move his face at all. Behind his shoulder the ruined barn showed its ribs to the rising dark. "You expect me to die here?" she said. It was not a question, and she did not say it with heat. She said it the way she would tell a labouring woman a hard truth, plainly and early, because a hard truth met early was a thing you could still do some work with. Something crossed his face at last. Not shame, quite. A flinch of the manners, perhaps, at hearing the whole cold transaction named out loud in the yard. "I expect nothing," he said. "I wish you no ill." "No," she agreed. "You wish me nothing at all. That is a different thing entirely, and a colder one, though I dare say you have never once had cause to learn the difference." He had no answer to that. He mounted the grey, and the instant he was up in the saddle his hands were sure, and his back was straight, and the courteous absence had closed over his face again like water over a dropped stone. He rode out through the broken gate without a backward glance, and the dark took the sound of the hoofs before it took the shape of him, and Adela Sutcliffe, Duchess of Kelmore, stood alone in the frozen yard of Cold Harbour, with a purse of almost nothing in her fist, and understood that she had been buried standing up, with the last shovel of earth still hanging in the air, waiting only on her to lie down. She stood a long time. The cold got down into the hip, and set it, singing its old high note. At last the old man cleared his throat behind her. "There's a fire in the tack room," he said. "The house chimneys don't draw. Begging your pardon, your grace." Smoke back down something wicked. She looked at the house, dark and square and full of ruin, a monument to a family that had let this place rot from the roof down. She looked at the low, warm square of the tack-room window near the stalls, where a fire that drew was burning. "Then I shall sit by the fire that draws," she said, "and you will tell me how many horses on this place are alive, and which of them are worth the hay they eat, and which are only dying slower than the rest. We will begin there." Wren blinked. It was, she thought long afterward, the first moment anyone at Cold Harbour had looked at her and seen not a corpse in waiting, but a living woman with a mind still working in her. He did not smile, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, an old horseman taking the measure of an animal he had written off, and finding, to his surprise, that it had stood up. She very nearly proved him wrong inside the month. The cold came down hard after Christmas, a black frost that split the water troughs and killed two of the weakest horses where they stood in the night, and it was in the worst of it that the weakness of her own blood declared itself, exactly as the physicians had promised the Duke it would. A fever took her. For 3 days she lay on the narrow cot in the tack-room and burned and shook and heard the old man's voice come and go from very far away. And there was a night she was certain was her last, when the ceiling beams swam and doubled and her heartbeat went thin and skipping as a flat stone thrown across water. 3 beats and a stumble, 3 beats and a stumble, and she thought, with a strange and floating calm, that the Duke had been right after all, and that it would be easy now, and that easy was its own kind of mercy. And then something in her that had been sitting down her whole long life stood up. She was not a woman given to visions, and she had none. She only lay in the black tack-room with the frost cracking the world to pieces outside the wall, and listened to her own poor stumbling heart. And she found, underneath the fever, that she was angry, not sad, not afraid, angry, cleanly and enormously, with a rage that was almost restful, at every soul who had ever looked at her and quietly measured her for a box, at the villagers who had crossed the lane, at the physicians who had priced her cheap to a duke's face, at the man who had bought her at that price and ridden away in the dusk, expecting the goods to spoil on their own and save him the bother. And she thought, quite clearly in the dark, "I will not die to make it convenient. I will not lie down to spare them the sight of me living. I have laboured too many nights over other women's lives to hand mine over now for nothing." By the grey of the 3rd morning, the fever had broken and left her wrung out and shaking, weak as a wet kitten, unable to stand without the wool to hold. But she was alive, and something behind her eyes had changed its mind about a great many things, and would not be changing it back. She did not return to the master's house. There was no sense in it, and she had never in her life done a thing merely because it was expected. The house was cold and grand and empty, a great echoing tomb to a family that had let the roof fall in, and she had no use for tombs while she was still in the business of living. She took the tack-room and the low stone cottage behind it, that had once been the stud-groom's lodging, and she had Wren and the boy sweep the chimney and hang a new shutter and stuff the gaps with moss and rag, and she moved her few belongings in beside the stalls, where the warmth of the horses came through the wall in the night like the breath of something large and patient and alive. It was no residence for a duchess. It stood close to the work, and the work, she had decided, was the only thing that would save any living creature on the place, herself first among them. She began, as she began everything, with the books. Wren brought them up out of a damp chest, the great stud books of Cold Harbour going back 40 years, heavy vellum gone soft at the edges with the wet, and Adela spread them on the mended table and read them by candle through the long dead evenings, the way she had once read the signs of a difficult birth, patiently, letting the pattern rise up out of the detail. She had no schooling in bloodstock, not a day of it, but she had spent her whole life reading bodies, reading what strength lay coiled in a frame and what weakness would tell in the end, and she found that a pedigree was in truth only another kind of family, and family she understood down to the marrow. She saw where the line had run true and strong in the old Duke's day, and where a lazy heir had bred for a fashionable colour and thrown the good hard blood away after it. She found 2 mares and 1 old stallion, in whom the true Coldharbour strain still ran deep and unspoiled, and a dozen more head that were eating hay they would never in their lives repay. "You mean to sell them," Wren said, watching her mark the page. He said it low, the way a man watches a stranger lay hands on a thing he has loved past all reason. "I mean to sell everything that cannot run and cannot breed," she said, "and feed what I keep on the money it brings. We cannot afford charity, Wren, not yet, not for a season or 2. Every mouth that cannot pay its way is stealing the bread from a mouth that can." She looked up at him. "I will not pretend it is kind. It is only necessary. There is a difference, and I have made my peace with it." He was quiet a while. Then he set one rough finger on the page, on the name of an old bay mare. "Not her," he said. "She's 14 and she's slipped 2 foals already, and she's carrying again now, carrying through all of this cold. If she throws it live, it'll be the best bred thing on the whole place, out of the last true daughter of the horse that won the whip in the old Duke's time. And if she throws it dead, likely as not, it'll take her down with it." He looked up, and his pale eyes were not tired now. They were fierce, and half ashamed of being fierce. "I'm asking you. Everything else on the place, mark it and sell it, and I'll not say a word. But not her, not the old mare." Adela looked at the old man a long moment, at the thing standing up in his face that was the very same thing that had stood up in her own chest in the dark. Loyalty to a losing cause was a fault. She knew that as well as any woman living. It was also the only quality she had ever truly respected in a soul, because it was the only one that could not be bought. "Show her to me," she said. The old bay mare stood in the best of the poor boxes with her sides swollen tight and her head hung low, and Adela put her midwife's hands flat on the great warm barrel of her, and felt, through hide and muscle, the shape of the life curled inside, the way she had felt 100 human lives before ever they came into the light. The foal lay wrong. She did not need to be a horsewoman to know it. She had felt that same wrongness under her hands in labouring women 100 times. The turned limb, the tangled cord, the birth that would never come on its own without a hand to go in and set it right. "When?" she said. "Any night now," said Wren. "January foal. Nobody with sense breeds for a January foal, but the old master let the stallion in when he shouldn't, and here we are. She'll drop it in the worst of the cold, if she drops it at all. Then we shall be ready in the worst of the cold," Adela said. And that same evening she began to boil her linen, and lay out the tools she had carried from the village in a roll of oilcloth, the same she had used on women, because that, she had decided, was exactly what this was going to be. The night came 10 days on, and it was the coldest of the whole hard year. The boy Pip woke her, a small quick shape at the cottage door with a horn lantern shaking in his fist and his breath smoking. He was an orphan out of the town who had drifted to Coldharbour, the way a leaf drifts into a sheltered corner, and simply stays, sleeping in the loose hay, asking for nothing, and he had appointed himself, without a word to anyone, the keeper and shadow of the old bay mare. "She's down," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "She's down, and she's groaning, and she can't get up, and Wren says, 'Come, come now, your grace, please.' She came. The hips screamed the whole way as she hauled herself across the frozen yard on Pip's thin shoulder, and her stick, and the wind was a flat knife off the heath, and in the box the old bay mare lay on her side in the straw and heaved and could not rise. Wren knelt at her great head. One look at his face in the swinging lantern light told Adela everything the man could not make himself say. "Foal's turned wrong," he got out. "I can't shift it. My hands are too big for the work, and my arms have gone too weak, God forgive me. And if we send to the town for a man, she'll be dead, and the foal with her before he's got his boots on." Adela looked at the labouring mare, at the vast and dangerous bulk of her, at the shod hooves that could stave in a skull with one blind kick. She thought of nothing at all in that moment, except that a birth was going wrong in front of her, and that she had two hands that knew, better than any hands in 3 parishes, how to make a wrong birth come right. She had never once in her life feared a labouring body. She saw no earthly reason to begin now, on account of its being larger than usual. "Hold her head," she said, and her voice came out steady and low and certain, the voice she used in the worst hour of a lying-in, the one that made frightened girls believe they would live. "Pip, bring the light in close and keep it steady, and then get back behind me and stay clear of her legs, both of you. If she thrashes, she'll not mean it, but she'll kill you just the same as if she did, and I'll not be explaining that to anyone." She stripped to her shift in the killing cold and knelt down in the straw and the blood and the steam, and she put her bared arm into the mare the way she had put it 100 times into women, past the wrist, past the elbow, into the hot straining dark, and there she found the foal. A foreleg turned clean back along the body, the head twisted under and away. She shut her eyes, because eyes were no use to her now, and she let her hands become her seeing, and she coaxed and turned and waited for the great muscles to ease their grip, and then coaxed again, patient as she had been for 100 terrified girls in 100 candlelit rooms, murmuring the same low stream of nonsense she had always murmured. "Easy now, easy, my girl. There's the road. Come the right road now. That's the way. Easy." The mare screamed and heaved and near crushed her arm against bone. Adela's shoulder wrenched in its socket, and the ruined hip was a white bar of fire under her, and she did not stop and she did not pull back. She found the second leg. She brought it round to lie beside the first. She felt the small soft nose come at last into its true line, above the 2 small hooves, the way it was meant to be, the way God or nature had drawn it, and she drew her aching arms slowly back and said, low and fierce and shaking, "Now, now, my girl, now you push." The mare pushed, and into Adela's waiting arms, in a great rush of steam and water and blood out into the frozen straw, came a colt. He was not breathing. For one long and terrible moment he lay slack and blue and boneless across her lap, dead-looking as any stillborn child she had ever had to hand back to a weeping mother, and Pip made a small broken sound in the dark behind her, and Adela did what she had done for the blue and silent babies through 20 hard years. She cleared the mouth with a hooked finger and wiped the streaming nostrils and rubbed the wet ribs hard, roughly, with a twist of dry straw, and then she bent and blew one sharp breath into the flaring nose and struck the small chest a flat, open-handed blow. "Breathe," she said, and there was nothing gentle in it at all now. It was a command flung in the face of death itself. "Breathe, you! You did not come all this hard way in the cold and the dark to quit on me in the straw. Breathe." The colt shuddered along his whole length. He drew one long, rattling, shivering breath and coughed, and shook his soaked and matted head, as if to clear it of the whole ordeal of being born, and drew another. And behind him the old bay mare heaved herself up off her side onto her chest, and swung her head round and put her muzzle to her son and made, deep down in her throat, the low, chuckling, rolling sound of a mare who has just decided, against all the evidence of the night, to live. Wren was weeping openly in the lantern light, and not troubling to hide it. Pip was laughing and crying at once, and Adela knelt in the bloody straw in her shift, with the steam rising off her bare shoulders, and the impossible living colt breathing warm across her knees. And she began helplessly to laugh too, a cracked and astonished sound she had not heard out of herself in years, because she was alive and the old mare was alive, and this impossible January foal that no man of sense would have bred was alive and breathing in her lap, and not one single soul who had measured her for a box had ever once thought her worth the hay. They wrote him into the book as Cold Harbour Lad, because in the end it was the only name that fit him. He was leggy and dark and ugly as unpaid sin for the first 6 months of his life, all knees and elbows and suspicion, and then, in the way of the very best of them, he came right all at once over a single summer, as though he had merely been waiting to be sure the world was worth the effort. By that autumn, even old Wren, who trusted nothing that walked on 2 legs, and precious little that walked on 4, would stand at the paddock rail of an evening and watched the colt stretch out across the grass and go silent in a way that said more than any words the old man owned. 3 years is a long time in the life of a horse. It is a longer time still in the life of a woman who has lately, and against advice, decided to live. The seasons turned over Cold Harbour, and Adela turned with them, and she did not waste a one of them. She sold off the deadweight stock, hard-headed and unsentimental, standing in the yard on sale days with her stick and her ledger, and her face shut, and she took the money and fed the good blood on it. She learned the trade the only way she had ever learned anything, on her knees and by feel and by failing and trying again, until she could tell a sound foot from a false one in the dark by the heat of it against her palm, and read a mare's readiness by the set of her tail and the look in her eye. She was up before the light and out long after it had gone, every day, and the hip never once healed and never once stopped its singing. But she found that a body worn out in useful work is a wholly different thing from a body worn out in idleness and waiting, and she made her private peace with the first and never again gave a thought to the second. As for the weakness of the blood the physicians had sworn would carry her off inside the year, it never once came back to trouble her through all the punishing labour of those seasons, and she came in time to think they had looked at a woman with nothing left to live for and mistaken the grey resignation in her face for a failing constitution, that they had, in the plain truth of it, priced a broken spirit as a dying body, and been wrong on the both of it. The barn was rebuilt, board by good board, out of the first true winnings, and Adela stood in the yard and watched the new rafters go up against the sky where the old dead ribs had stood, and said nothing, and felt something. Cold Harbour Lad ran in his second season at the small country meetings, at Bury, and at the little flat courses where a farm's whole hope could ride on an afternoon, and he won, and then he won again, and men who had never in their lives heard the name of the place began to say it low in the betting rings and ask each other who stood behind it. There was money now, not a fortune, but a living working flow of it, and Adela put back into the ground and the horses and the roof every shilling that was not owed elsewhere. She hired 2 grooms, and then 2 more, and the yard that had held starved and dying beasts came to hold sleek and glossy ones that looked over their half-doors at the world with the bright, hard, confident eye of animals that are fed and worked and valued. She never once wrote to the Duke, he never once wrote to her, and she found, when she troubled to examine it, that she thought of him, but rarely, and that when she did, it was without much heat any more, the way one remembers a hard winter that is safely past and cannot come at you again. But in the end it was not the colt that made the name of Cold Harbour. It was the mares, and the thing her hands could do that no other hands nearby could. The word went out from Newmarket the way such words always go, groom to groom over ale in the low taverns, of the lame woman at the mended farm with the hands that could save a foal no other soul could save, who could turn a birth that 3 men had given up on and bring it living into the straw. They began to bring her the ruined cases, the ones there was nothing left to lose on, the mare that had slipped 3 foals running and broken her owner's heart and his purse together, the costly filly gone barren that no stallion could touch, the great and famous brood mare, carrying a fortune folded in her belly, whom every wise head on the heath had shaken over and declared would die of the foaling. They brought them down the mended lane to Adela Sutcliffe, because they had nothing left to lose by it, and she took them in, because a difficult birth was the one thing in all the turning world she had never learned to fear, and one by one, through patience and the reading hands and the long freezing vigils on her knees, she brought the foals of half of Newmarket living into the world. She lost some. She was always honest, brutally and unfashionably honest, about the ones she lost, and it was that, in the end, more than any triumph that made men trust her, for a breeder who will name her failures may be believed about the rest. But she saved far more than she lost, and the foals she saved grew up to carry names that men said with their hats coming off, and in the 3rd spring a quiet gentleman in a plain and well-cut coat rode down the mended lane, dismounted in the raked and ordered yard, and gave his name as the master of the king's horse. The king's own brood mares, he said, had lately had the very worst of luck, 3 foals lost in 2 seasons, and the best of the royal mares now heavy and foal, and every physician of the turf shaking his head over her. "His Majesty," the quiet gentleman said, with the ghost of something dry behind it, did not greatly care for the shaking of heads. His Majesty had heard there was a woman down near Newmarket who did not shake her head over anything. Would she take the mares? Adela Sutcliffe stood in the yard she had built up out of her own open grave, and she thought, for one long moment, of the frozen night, 3 years gone, when a duke had put a purse of almost nothing into her cold hand and ridden away in the dusk to let her die. And she did not smile, for she had never been a woman who smiled easily, but something in her went very still, and very warm, and very sure. "Bring them," she said, "and tell His Majesty that they will foal under my name, in my books, in my care, or they will not foal under my roof at all. I have been a hired hand, sir, used and forgotten, and given nothing for it, and I did not care for the trade. If the king's horses stand at Cold Harbour, they stand as mine, registered to my name, or they do not stand here." The master of the king's horse looked at the lame woman in the plain moss-grey wool, and at the raked yard and the sound new roof and the deep-chested glossy horses looking over their doors, and he was a shrewd man who had spent his life judging worth, and he understood entirely what he was looking at. "I will tell him," he said, and he did, and the king, who valued a living foal above any question of whose name stood in the book, agreed to it without a blink. So it was that in the 3rd winter after her abandonment, the brood mares of the King of England stood in the loose boxes of Cold Harbour, and the great stud books bore across their pages the name of Adela Sutcliffe, Duchess of Kelmore, breeder, in her own black hand, and a new block of good stone rose along the yard with the royal cipher cut deep and proud into the lintel above its door. And it was in that same winter, the ledgers of a great and half-forgotten estate, having at last been forced to a reckoning by his lawyers and by the exhausted patience of his grasping cousin, that Ralph Sutcliffe, Duke of Kelmore, rode home to take possession of his worthless land at last, and sell off whatever little the failing ruin would fetch. He came alone, on a tall grey horse, down the lane he remembered as a ruin. The 3 hard years had not been kind to him, though they had been kind to his consequence. He had wed his bride the day before the birthday, and secured the entailed land for good, exactly as he had planned it, and Hugo had been left clutching at a single desperate hope, to prove before the courts that the marriage had been no true marriage at all, void from its first hour, so that in the eye of the law Ralph had never been a husband, and the old condition of the will stood forever unmet. But a marriage witnessed and registered is a hard thing to call a fiction, and the suit had ground on and gone nowhere, and everyone concerned had quietly assumed the sickly bride would settle the whole business herself by dying a natural widow's death, and leaving her widower free and clear of cousin and courts together. When word had at last reached Ralph, through the dry paragraphs of a lawyer's letter, that his Duchess had somehow failed to die, that indeed there was now some troublesome business of a farm attached to her that wanted settling, he had felt mostly a weary irritation. The woman was still living. Well, that was, he supposed, to the good, as far as the entail went. He would ride down and settle the property, sell off whatever could be got for the ruin, make the poor creature some small provision in a market town, where a woman could be looked after cheaply, and put the whole distasteful business behind him at last. He had not, if he was honest with himself, thought of her in many months, and he had preferred it so. There was a thing he had done at Cold Harbour, 3 winters gone, that he did not care to hold up to the light and turn over. He came down the lane expecting broken and gaping fences, and found instead new rails painted white and standing square. He came expecting the black skeleton of the fallen barn, and found a long sound-weathered roof, and beside it a second block, new built of good grey stone, and cut deep into the lintel above its door a device he knew as intimately as the face in his own glass, because he had seen it his whole life on the king's letters, and the king's liveries, and the king's plate, the royal cipher, here, cut into stone in the mud of Cold Harbour, at the arse end of the world, where he had come to bury a woman. He drew rein in the middle of the yard, and did not, for a long moment, dismount. The yard was raked into clean straight lines. Horses looked out over the half-doors of the boxes, with the bright, hard eye of well-fed, well-worked animals, and they were beautiful, every one of them, deep-chested and clean-limbed and glossy even under the ruff of their winter coats. A groom he did not know crossed the yard with a brimming bucket and touched his cap, but not to the mounted duke. He touched it toward the door of the tack-room, the way a man defers to the true authority of a place, and passed on about his work without a second look at the stranger on the grey. Somewhere out of sight a forge was ringing, steady and busy. Everywhere was order and use, and a quiet, unhurried working prosperity, and Rafe Sutcliffe sat his horse in the heart of it, like a man who has ridden up to the wrong house entirely, and cannot for his life understand how. Old Wren came out of the new stone block, wiping his hands. He was older, and somehow straighter for it, and he wore a good plain coat, and he looked up at the mounted duke out of his pale eyes with not one single particle of deference anywhere in his weathered face. "Your Grace," he said, "we had word you might be coming." "Wren!" Rafe's own voice was not quite as even as he wished it. "What is all this? Whose horses are these? What in God's name is the king's cipher doing cut into a wall on my land?" "Not your land," said Wren, with a terrible and unhurried mildness, as a man corrects a small point of fact. "Begging your pardon. You'd best speak to the Duchess about the whole of it. She's in the office." And he tipped his head toward the stone block and went back to his work, and left the Duke of Kelmore to get down off his horse in his own yard by himself. Rafe dismounted. He was aware, as he had been aware every waking moment of his life since he was 7 years old, of the great animals watching him from every open door, and of the old cold crawl that started up in his belly whenever he came near them, the crawl he had spent 30 years and a duke's whole store of cold pride learning to hide. A single quiet horse under saddle he could master by main force of will, white-knuckled on the reins, for a duke who could not sit a horse was no duke at all, and he had beaten that much into himself as a boy. But it was the loose animals he could not bear, the crowded stable-yard and the close, dark foaling box, the churned and trampled ground where a horse held all the power and a man none, and that was the one country he had spent 30 years refusing ever to enter. He handed the grey off quickly to the strange groom, and stepped back from it quickly, and if the old man marked it, the old man said nothing. The office was a plain, warm, low room off the new block, with a fire that drew clean and a great scarred table spread over with the heavy vellum books, and behind the table stood a woman he did not, for one whole and disorienting heartbeat, know. She was straight. That was the first thing his eye told him, before any other. She stood with a stick set ready to her hand, but she stood square and easy and rooted on her own ground, her weight settled, and she was weathered brown from 3 years of the heath wind, and there was iron grey now threaded at her temples that had not been there, and she wore good plain wool the deep colour of winter moss. She looked up from the page she was marking, and her eyes were the same, exactly and entirely the same, dark and level and reading him clean through the way they had read him in a cold chapel 3 years gone, and Rafe Sutcliffe felt the floor of his certainty tilt and slide under his good boots. "Adela," he said. It came out of him unguarded, her plain name, before he could dress it up. "Your Grace." She set down her pen with care, and she did not come round the table to him. "You look well. Duty has kept you these years, I have no doubt. It so often does keep a great man from the country." He stopped. He was a man of composed and finished speeches, and he discovered, standing there, that he had not one of them left. "The lawyers told me the property had grown troublesome. They did not tell me." He moved one hand helplessly at the room, the books, the window, and the ordered, impossible yard beyond it. "What is this? What have you done here?" "This is a stud farm," she said. "A working one, and lately a rather good one. It breeds racehorses, some of the best in the eastern counties, as it presently happens." She let that sit in the warm air between them a moment, unhurried. "You will have seen the new block, and what is cut over its door. The king's brood mares stand there. 3 of them carry this spring, and his majesty is anxious over them, for he has lost foals elsewhere and does not intend to lose these. They stand under my name, your Grace, in my books, in my hand, in my care. The royal warrant is framed upon that wall behind you, if your eye should want the proof of it." He turned, and it was there, framed and glazed and sealed, naming Adela Sutcliffe, Duchess of Kelmore, breeder, under the king's own hand. He turned back to her, and something moved across his closed and handsome face that had never once been permitted there in the chapel, nor in the yard, nor anywhere in his whole ordered life. A total, staggered, wordless undoing. "You are the breeder," he said. It came out of him almost stupid, almost a child's flat repetition. You are the woman they speak of on the heath, the one who saves the foals no one else can save." He stopped. His hand had gone to the back of a chair. "I came here to sell this place." "Yes," she said. "I have no doubt you did. You came to seize a worthless ruin and to settle some small kind sum upon the widow you fully expected to find, and to be gone from it again by supper, without ever having to spend a night. I'm sorry, Rafe, to have disappointed you a second time. I did not die the first, and I will not be sold the second." She came round the table now, slow and even, her weight rolling over the bad hip in the gait she had long since stopped being ashamed of, and she stood before him. Close, and she was not tall, and she leaned upon her stick, and she was, in that plain, warm room, entirely and unarguably his master, and they both of them knew it to the bone. "The land may stand in your name upon some lawyer's parchment, and I will not waste an afternoon arguing the deeds with you, but the stud is mine. The horses are mine, every one of them bought or bred or saved with my own 2 hands. The new block and the mended roof and the sound white rails were raised out of money I made from nothing at all. And the king's mares stand under my warrant and my name, and you cannot sell one hair of any of it, nor turn me off this ground while the king's horses foal on it and the marriage stands between us. You may lodge here, if you have need of it, and nowhere better to go. As a guest, there is a chamber in the old house that keeps the rain out now, which is a good deal more than it did when you left me to it. But everything on this land that is worth the having, I made, and not one hair of it is yours. You made very certain of that 3 winters ago, when you gave me nothing at all and rode away. A thing given nothing owes nothing back. You taught me that yourself in this very yard, and I have never once forgotten the lesson." He stood in the firelight and took it, every measured word of it, and to his small and only credit he did not bluster and did not draw himself up on his rank. He was too thoroughly undone to reach for either. "I did you a great wrong," he said at last, very low. "You did," she agreed without heat, as she might have agreed that it was cold out. "We will not pretend otherwise between us. It saves a deal of time, and I have work to do." She turned back to her books, and her voice went brisk and final. "You may stay the night, since the roads are bad and the light is going. Wren will show you the chamber. Supper is at 7 in the tack-room kitchen, and we do not dress for it here." He stayed the night, and then, because the roads truly were bad and the frost had come down again, he stayed a second. And then the king's own letter came down to say that the mares must foal at Cold Harbour, whatever befell, that not one of them was to be moved, and the Duke of Kelmore, who owned the very ground they stood upon and commanded not one living creature that walked on it, found that he could not, in decency or in wounded pride, simply mount up and ride away from the one place in all of England that had made a plain fool of him without ever raising its voice. He stayed, and the staying was the beginning of the long unmaking of the man he had been. He was at the first entirely and completely useless, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was where the change in him began. He was a duke. He had never in his whole life mucked out a stall, nor carried a water bucket, nor mended a rail, nor done 1 hour of work that raised a blister. At Cold Harbour, these were the only things under heaven that counted for anything, and rank bought a man precisely nothing of them. The grooms took their orders from Wren, and Wren took his from the Duchess, and the Duke of Kelmore stood about in the middle of the raked yard in his fine boots and his fine coat, and was, for the first time in the whole of his life, simply and continually in everyone's way. It galled him past speech. And then, one grey and bitter afternoon, a rail came down in the far paddock under the shove of a bored yearling, and small Pip could not lift the wet, heavy timber back into its sockets alone however he strained at it, and Rafe, because he could not stand 1 more hour of being useless in his own ruin while a child struggled, took off his fine coat and hung it on the post, and put his own shoulder under the rail and lifted. He raised his first blisters that first week, and stood looking at his own 2 palms as though they belonged to a stranger. He learned to muck a box and carry water and fork down hay, and he was slow and clumsy and wrong at all of it, and the grooms watched him with an open scorn that wore down over the slow days into something grudging as they saw that the great man turned up again at first light with his blistered hands wrapped in rag, and did not quit and did not complain, and did not once fall back on his rank to excuse himself the work, but he would not go near the horses. That was noted, up and down the yard, though no one said it to his face. He would do any labour in the yard that did not require him to lay his bare hand upon a living horse, and he found 100 plausible reasons why the other work should fall to other men, and Adela, watching from the office window with the ledger open and forgotten under her hand, said nothing at all. But she watched, and she had spent her whole life reading the truths that bodies tell when their owners are working hardest to keep them hid, and she read his, and she held her peace, and she wondered. She would not, in those first weeks, let herself do more than wonder. That was her own wound, and she knew it as surely as she knew the ache that lived in her hip and woke with the rain. She had built a fortress up out of an open grave, stone by hard stone, and the deepest stone in the whole of it, the one all the rest were set upon, was the plain, flat certainty that no one stayed. Her mother had died, and left her. Her father had died, and left her. The village had crossed the lane and left her. The Duke had ridden off into the dusk without one backward look, and left her to the cold. She had built herself a life at last that needed no living soul in it, and she guarded the building of it the way old Wren had guarded the doomed bay mare, past all sense and reason, because it was the one single thing in all her years that had never yet betrayed her. And now the very man who had buried her was out in her yard at first light, carrying her water with his soft ruined hands, and she felt the wall of her fortress, in one small place low down, begin against her will to want to come down, and it frightened her more than any breech berth she had ever set her hand to in the dark. The first shifting of the ground between them came not from her softening, but from her cousin's spite reaching down the lane. Hugo Sutcliffe had not been idle in the 3 years since the chapel. He had watched with mounting disgust as the marriage he had counted upon to end conveniently in a grave instead put down roots and flourished, and when the news reached him at last that the king's own mares now stood at Cold Harbour under the cripple's name, he changed his line of attack. He could not now hope for a widower cousin, but he could poison the ground beneath her feet. He went to work quietly upon the master of the king's horse, and upon the steward who kept the royal book, letting drop, here a word and there a word, that the woman at Cold Harbour was no fit keeper of his majesty's bloodstock, a low-born village woman, a cripple, a person of no family and no standing, who had got her place by trickery and a false marriage, and whose farm was surely no safe or seemly stable for the king's horses. Let the mares be moved, he urged, to a proper stud under a proper man, before some scandal or some disaster attached the king's name to hers. The steward, who was a cautious man with his own place to think of, began to waver, and word of the wavering came down the heath to Cold Harbour, and Adela read the letter twice and set it down, and felt the old cold certainty rise in her, that the powerful would always in the end close ranks against her, and that she would fight this as she had fought everything, alone. She did not fight it alone. Rafe read the letter over her shoulder, uninvited, and his face, which had been slowly thawing these weeks into something almost human, went hard and still and cold in a wholly different way, an aristocrat's cold, the cold of a man who has just seen a lesser man reach for a thing that is his to protect. "Hugo," he said. It was not a question. "This is Hugo's hand under it. I know the smell of him." "It does not matter whose hand it is," Adela said, reaching for her pen. "It matters that the steward believes it. I will write to him myself, and lay out the books and the records, and let the foals I have saved speak for—" "No," Rafe said, "you will not write to the steward. The steward does not know you, and he half believes my cousin, and a letter from the accused proves nothing to a cautious man. He knows me." He was already drawing paper toward himself, and there was in his movements now a swift and certain competence she had never seen in him in the yard, the competence of a man moving at last in the one country he had been bred to. "He has known me the whole of his life, and he knows precisely what my cousin is and what my cousin wants, and he knows that a duke does not put his own name and his own hand behind a woman's stud for the pleasure of it. Let me write to him. Let the weight of the thing be mine, not yours, this once. It is the one coin I have left that is worth anything here, and I had rather spend it on you than keep it." She looked at him a long moment across the table, the pen still in her hand. It was the first time in 3 years that his power had been offered as a shield to stand in front of her, rather than as a wall to shut her out behind. She did not thank him. She was not ready yet to thank him for anything. But she set down her pen and moved the inkwell across to him, and that was its own kind of answer, and he took it as one. He wrote to the master of the king's horse and to the steward, and what he wrote was cold and brief and deadly. He set his whole name and his whole rank behind Adela Sutcliffe, breeder, and behind the record of what her hands had done that no man's hands on the heath could do, and he named his cousin's motive plainly, the entail and the spite of it, and he made it courteously and unmistakably known that any man who moved against the Duchess of Kelmore's stud on Hugo Sutcliffe's whispered word would find himself moving against the Duke of Kelmore in fact. Then he sealed it and sent it by his own man that same hour, and within the fortnight the steward's wavering had firmed into something very like devotion, and Hugo's whispers came to nothing, and the mares stayed where they stood. It was, Adela thought, watching the king's man ride back up the lane with the matter mended, the first useful thing the Duke of Kelmore had ever done for her. It was not, she was careful to remind herself, the same as staying. A man may spend a coin and ride away the next morning all the same, but it was something, and she found, to her private unease, that she had begun to keep a reckoning of the somethings, and that the column was no longer empty. The wound cracked open, when at last it cracked, in the deep of the following February, on a frozen night, much like the one that had made her. One of the king's mares, the great anxious one every wise head had shaken over, came to her time in the bitter dark, and she came to it badly. Adela was in the box with her from before midnight, on her knees in the straw in the cold, and it was a long and grinding and merciless labour, the foal large and the mare frightened, and the whole thing wanting turning and coaxing and endless patient work with the reading hands, hour upon hour, while the frost cracked outside, and the lantern burned low and was refilled and burned low again. She brought it right in the end. She always, or nearly always, brought it right. A little before dawn the king's foal came living, and whole into the straw, and drew its first breath, and its mother turned to it with the low chuckling sound, and it was as fine a colt as the royal stud had thrown in 10 years, and by every measure it was a triumph. But she had knelt too long in the killing cold, hunched and straining over the ruined hip, hour on hour, and when the work was finished and she went to rise from the straw, the old injury seized in her like a trap sprung shut. The hip locked and would not bear her, and a pain went through it so white and so total that the box swam and darkened at its edges, and her leg folded under her without her leave, and she went down into the straw beside the mare, and could not for all her will get up again. She lay there in the bloody straw with the newborn colt, and could not rise, and the shame of it, the plain animal helplessness of it, after all her years of never once needing a hand, was worse by far than the pain. It was Rafe who found her. He had not gone to his bed. He had been in the yard the whole long night, hovering at the edge of the lantern light, unable to come into the box for the terror of the great labouring animal within it, and equally unable to go away and leave her to it. And he heard the change in the silence, and he came to the door, and he saw her down in the straw and not getting up. And he came in. He came into the box where the great mare stood over her new foal, into the exact shape of the thing he had feared his whole life, and his face was grey and running with sweat in the cold, and his hands were shaking, but he came in, and he got down into the straw beside her, and he got his arms under her. "I have you," he said, and his voice shook as badly as his hands. "Be still. I have you. Put your arms about my neck." "I can manage," she said through her teeth, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and it was the last thing she said before she let him take her weight. He carried her out of the box and across the frozen yard to the cottage, and she was no light burden, and he was not a strong man in that way, and he was shaking the whole while with the horses and the cold and the effort of it, but he did not put her down, and he did not stop. He laid her on the cot by the fire, and he built the fire up high with his own soft ruined hands, and then he did a thing she had not looked for at all. He sat down on the floor by the cot, and he took the locked and screaming hip between his two palms, and he began, slowly and clumsily, and with a gentleness she had not known was in him, to chafe the warmth back into it, to work at the seized muscle the way she had once told a groom to work at a foundered horse, until, by inches, over the grey hour toward the dawn, the trap eased, and the white panes sank down to its old dull singing, and she could breathe again without her breath catching on it. He did not speak while he did it. Neither did she. She lay and watched the fire and felt the cruel man who had buried her, working the warmth back into her ruined body with his own two hands, and something in the deep stone wall of her, in that small low place, quietly gave way, and she let it, and she said nothing at all, because to say anything would have been to admit that it had. That was wound the first, and how it cracked the hostility between them. Wound the second broke open 6 nights later, and it was fire that broke it. No one ever after knew for certain how the fire started. A lantern kicked over by a restless horse, perhaps. A coal spat from the forge into old dry straw and smouldering unseen for hours. Small Pip smelled the smoke first, out of his sleep in the loft, and his scream woke the whole yard, and Adela came out of the cottage into a nightmare of orange light and roaring wind. The old wooden barn was burning, and the fire was running along the range toward the new stone block where the King's mares stood, and where, in the far end box, penned and screaming, stood Cold Harbour Lad. She never afterward could give a clear account of what she did next, except that she had spent 4 hard years learning that the only thing to be done with a disaster is to walk straight into the middle of it. She went into the burning range. The hip did not matter, and the smoke did not matter. There were living things behind those doors that would burn where they stood, and she had never once in her whole life turned away from a living thing because it was hard or dangerous to reach. She got 3 of the mares out, hauling on their halters, throwing her own shawl over their rolling eyes, and she fought her way down the smoke-choked range to the far box, where the great colt she had pulled living from the straw. 3 winters gone stood plunging and screaming in the smoke, and she got the bolt back and the door open, and then the beam came down. She did not remember the beam. She remembered only the floor of the box coming up at her, and a great weight of smoke pressing down on her chest, and a roaring that filled the whole world, and then, from very far away and getting nearer, a man's voice shouting her name in a register she had never once heard from him, raw and cracked and stripped of every particle of his cold composure. Rafe Sutcliffe stood in the yard and watched the burning range that held his wife, and every muscle in his body locked. He was 7 years old again. He was standing in the stable-yard at Kelmore in the sunshine, watching his father go down under the hooves of a maddened stallion, watching the man he loved best in the world be broken to pulp in the churned mud, while the grooms screamed and could not reach him, and the horse would not be caught, and the horror of that morning had lived in his body every hour of the 30 years since, a paralysis he had buried and buried again under a duke's cold disdain. He had built his whole life around never again going near the great killing animals. He had, God forgive him, chosen a horse farm above all the ruins in England to abandon a woman at, partly because it was the one place on the earth he would never be tempted to come himself, and now she was in there, in the fire, among the maddened horses, because of the horses, and he found, standing frozen in the roaring light, that there was one single thing in all the world stronger than the terror that had owned him for 30 years, and that it was her. He went in. He went into the smoke and the falling fire and the screaming, plunging horses, into the exact and living shape of his oldest nightmare, and he found her down under the fallen beam with the great colt rearing over her, and he set his shoulder under the burning timber and heaved it up out of 30 years of buried horror, and he got his hands under her arms and dragged her back out of the box and down the range and out into the cold, clean air of the yard, while Cold Harbour Lad, freed, bolted past them both into the night and away. He went down onto his knees in the frozen mud, with her held hard against him, and she was breathing, coughing, cursing him weakly and alive, black with soot from brow to chin, and he held her, and he shook, and he could not stop shaking, and all around them the grooms and old Wren and the King's own men fought the fire down to steaming embers, and left the 2 of them there where they knelt, because some things are private, even in the middle of a burning yard. They lost the old wooden barn to the ground. They saved, in the end, every horse and every human soul on the place. Cold Harbour Lad they found at the first grey light, standing at the far end of the home paddock, blowing hard and wild about the eye, but without a single mark on him, and small Pip walked out to him across the frozen grass, and set a hand on his neck, and led him home to a sound box. And so the fire that took the barn left every living thing behind it whole. And in the grey, wet, exhausted dawn, in the cottage, with her lungs still labouring at the smoke and her hands still black with it, Adela sat and watched the Duke of Kelmore sit on the hearthstone at her feet, and shake, and be unable to stop, and she understood at last the whole of what she had been reading in him for weeks, and had not let herself name. "You are afraid of them," she said. Her voice was a smoke-ruined rasp. "The horses. You have been afraid of them all along, since before you ever came here." He did not deny it. He had gone far past denying anything at all. He looked into her fire, and in a flat, halting voice, a boy's voice underneath the Duke's, he told her. The stable-yard at Kelmore in the sun, the maddened stallion, his father going down in the mud and not getting up, the grooms screaming, the 30 years of it living in his body every day since. And then, worst of all, in the same flat voice, he told her the shameful root of it. "I chose to bury you here," he said, "at a stud farm, among the one thing on this earth I could not make myself come near, in the one grave I would never once be tempted to visit, so that you would be gone and forgotten, and I would never have to see it, nor smell it, nor set foot near it. That is the kind of man I was, Adela. That is precisely the calculation I made in cold blood in a lawyer's office. You should know the whole of it, and not think me better than I am." She was quiet a long while. The fire ticked and settled. Outside in the grey light the grooms were dragging the burnt and steaming timbers clear of the standing stone. She said at last. It was not forgiveness. It was only an observation, offered plainly, the way she offered everything. But he heard the tense of it, the single small changed word, was, and not am, and he looked up at her from the hearthstone, and something passed between the two of them in the grey dawn light that neither of them yet had the courage to give a name to, and neither of them named it. They let it pass unnamed and unspoken, because they were, the two of them, exactly and completely alike in that one thing. They said the practical word aloud and left the true one in the dark, where it was safe, where it could not be taken away from them, where no one could ride off at dawn and leave it in the cold. That was the high water of them, the false and shining spring of it, and it crested in the mending weeks that followed, quiet and unlooked for and almost unbearably sweet. For he learned the horses after the fire. He made himself learn them. Now that she knew the shape of his terror, he could no longer hide it, and so he stopped trying, and instead he set himself against it, morning after morning, the way she had set herself against her own grave. He would stand at a half-door with the old cold crawl running like meltwater down his spine, and he would make himself put his bare hand flat upon a warm neck and leave it there and breathe, while Adela stood nearby and said nothing and did not help and did not need to, because the whole of the help was in the standing near. He gentled the yearlings under Wren's growled instruction and got stepped on and cursed and came back the next day. He blistered his soft hands anew and let them harden. The terror did not vanish, for such things do not vanish, but it stopped owning him, room by room, until it was only a scar he carried and not a hand at his throat. And a scar is a thing a man can live a whole life alongside. And the grooms who had scorned the useless Duke came, one by one, to nod to him, as a man who had walked into a burning barn among the maddened horses for the mistress of the place, and small Pip took to trailing after him about the yard exactly as he had once trailed only after the colt. And there came, at the very crest of it, an evening in the mending of the year, a long gold May evening with the light coming down level and unbroken across the heath, when the mares were turned out into the far paddock with their new spring foals, the king's fine colt among them, all of them running and bucking in the low gold light, for the sheer animal joy of the grass and the warmth. Adela stood at the paddock rail and watched the foals she had pulled living into the world, run in the grass she had raked up out of a ruin, and Rafe crossed the yard to her, unhurried, and stood beside her at the rail, and after a while he brought his hand along the top rail and laid it over hers, and did not grip it, and did not speak, only laid his warm hand over her cold one and left it there, and she did not move her hand from under his. The foals ran, the gold light held and held. Somewhere behind them Pip was laughing at something, and old Wren's pipe smoke drifted blue on the still air, and for one whole and unguarded moment, standing at the rail of the thing she had built with her own two hands, with the man who had buried her keeping quiet and steady and unafraid at her side, Adela Sutcliffe let herself believe that the long war was over, and that she had won it, and that a body could, after everything, be stayed with. Neither of them said the word. That was the whole nature of the false high, that it felt in the gold light like a thing already promised, and that nothing at all had in truth been promised, and that both their old wounds lay quiet under it, but not one bit healed, only sleeping. She felt his hand warm over hers, and she thought, this is what it would be, and she let herself think it, and that was as far as either of them went, and it was exactly and precisely because she had let herself think it, let herself stand in the gold light and believe, that the thing broke. For the moment she believed it, the deep old wall in her felt of a sudden how far down it had come, and how much of her was now standing out in the open past its ruins, and how much, how unbearably much she now stood to lose if the man beside her turned out to be, after all, a man who left. Every ancient certainty she had built her whole survival upon rose up in her, in the small dark hours of that same night, and told her, in her mother's silence and her father's silence and the silence of the empty lane, that no one stays, no one stays, and the further a wall is torn down, the harder and colder the wind gets in over its ruin. By the next morning she had drawn herself back in, deliberately, stone by stone, hauling the wall back up in the dark. She was cool with him at breakfast, and short and busy, and would not meet his eye, and he felt the change come down between them like a shutter, and could not understand it, and had not the words to ask. The gold evening at the rail became a thing they did not speak of, a door that had swung open in the light and been quietly firmly shut in the dark, and neither of them knew how to open it again, and the distance came back into the yard between them, and sat there. And then the king's courier came at the gallop down the lane, in the royal livery, and the door that had merely been shut was blown clean off its hinges. He brought two things, the courier, by the cruel chance of the same hour. The first was a summons. The king, delighted past measure with his living foals and his fine new colt, and reminded thereby of the Duke of Kelmore, whom he had not seen at court these 3 long years, commanded Rafe to Newmarket, and beyond the plain command the letter hinted broad and warm at more, at office, at place, at favour, at the whole great glittering machinery of court and consequence and prestige that had always been Rafe's birthright, and that had gone so strangely, so completely silent, through all these months while he learned to muck a stall and gentle a yearling, and lay his hand upon a warm neck without shaking. The king had remembered him. The king had a use for a duke. The old, cold, splendid world reached its arm all the way down the muddy lane, and took hold of him again by the collar. And the second thing the courier carried down, folded in the same satchel by ill fortune, was a letter from the lawyers. Hugo Sutcliffe, having watched his cousin's marriage, stubbornly refused to oblige him with a grave, and having been beaten back once already from the king's steward, had changed his whole line of attack and gone to the root. The marriage, he now argued before the courts, had never been consummated, had never been anything but a paper fiction got up to cheat the entail, a fraud upon the law and a mockery of the sacrament. Let it therefore be struck down as void from its very first hour, so that in the eye of the law the Duke had never taken a wife at all, and the old condition of the will stood forever unmet, and then the entailed estates would fall to Hugo after all, and with them, in the tangle of the old settlements, the very ground on which Cold Harbour stood. The suit would be heard within the month, and if it carried, Adela Sutcliffe would be once more, and in the cold eye of the law, nothing whatever. No wife, no duchess, no owner of the land beneath the king's mares, only a lame village midwife who had briefly and fraudulently borne a name that was now to be taken back off her. Rafe read both letters standing in the yard, and Adela stood a little apart and watched him read them, and she watched the old world take hold of him as he read, watched his shoulders settle back by long habit into the carriage of a duke, and she did the one thing she had been braced her whole life to do. She did not wait to be left. She left first. She had promised herself, on the coldest night of her first winter, that she would never again stand in this yard and watch a man decide whether or not to keep her, and she meant to keep that promise, though it broke her to do it. "Well," she said, and her voice had gone all the way back to the flat-cutting voice of the chapel 3 winters cold. "There it is, then. The king wants his duke back, and your cousin wants his entail, and between the pair of them you may have your whole life again, exactly and entirely as it was before you were ever fool enough to come down here. Take the annulment, Rafe. It cost you nothing, and it hands you everything. You never wanted a lame wife, and you never once wanted this ruin, and now you may be quit of the both of us, with the law's own blessing and the king's favour waiting at the far end of the road. Go to Newmarket. Take the place at court. Let Hugo have his paper. I will manage. I have always managed. I manage before you, and I shall manage a great deal better after." "Adela," he began. "I built this," she said, and now at last the heat broke through, 3 years of it, all at once, and her voice shook with it. "Out of the grave you dug me and left me standing in. Not you, me, with these hands, and I do not need you to stay for the keeping of it, and I will not stand in this yard a second time and watch a man weigh me against his life and find me wanting. I watched you ride away from me once already, at dawn, without so much as a backward look, and I lived, and I built all of this over the top of where you left me. I will not do it twice, so do it now, and do it quickly, and for the love of God do not make me a speech about it. Take your land, and your title, and your king, and go." And she turned on her stick and went into the office and shut the door behind her, and stood with her back hard against it in the dark, her heart going like the hoofs of a bolting horse, and she thought, coldly and clearly, and with a terrible bleak triumph, "There, I have done it before it could be done to me. I have chosen the losing of him, and so no one has taken it from me. It does not hurt one grain the less, but it is mine, this once, and that will have to be enough, as everything has always had to be enough." And on the far side of the shut door, Rafe Sutcliffe stood alone in the middle of the yard she had built, with 2 letters in his hand, and every road of his old, splendid life thrown open before him, and he did not move toward a single one of them. The low of it lasted, and it was meant to last, and neither of them let the other see the whole of it. She kept to the office and the far boxes through those days, and she worked, because work was the one thing that had never yet failed her, and she did not weep, because she had long ago spent all the weeping she had on things that could not be helped, and this, she had decided, was only one more of them. But she found she could not eat, and she found that the yard she had raised up out of nothing had gone grey and flat and tasteless to her, as though the gold had gone out of the light for good, and she understood, kneeling in the straw over a mare's split hoof with her hands doing the work by themselves, that she had lied to herself at the shut door. It was not enough, the choosing of the loss. It was only a way to own the loss instead of being owned by it, and it was a colder thing to hold than she had let herself remember, and she had held cold things before, but she had thought, these last gold weeks, that she might be done with holding them, and she was not, and the knowing of it sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. And Rafe kept to the yard and to the work, and he did not go to Newmarket, and he did not answer the king's letter, and he did not sign the lawyer's paper, and he did not, above all, come to her door. He had ridden away from her once with a whole speech ready on his tongue, and he had learned, these months, exactly what his speeches were worth to her, which was nothing. He knew, with the slow, certain knowledge the work had beaten into him, that there was not one word left in the whole of the language that she would believe out of his mouth. She had told him plainly not to make her a speech, and for once in his life he understood a thing entirely, and it was this, that whatever he did now, he must do, and not say, and that it must be a thing that could not be taken back, and that if it was not, she would be right about him forever, and right to be. So he said nothing, to her or to anyone, and he worked, and he watched the road for the king's steward who was coming down within the month to see the truth of the annulment suit for himself, and he made, in the long silence, in the deep of himself, the only decision he had ever made in his whole life that was wholly his own and not his rank's, and he told not a living soul what it was. The steward came on a grey, still morning at the very end of the month, a shrewd, quiet, careful man in a plain, good coat, riding down the mended lane to see with his own eyes whether the king's bloodstock stood on ground, whose ownership was now in question before the courts. For the king did not care to have his mares foaling on land that might any day pass to a stranger by a lawsuit. And he came into the yard and found the whole of Cold Harbour gathered there in the grey light to meet him, the grooms and old Wren and small Pip, white-faced at the edge, and the two lawyers Hugo had sent down with their satchel of papers, and the Duchess standing straight and cold and alone by the office door, her stick in her hand and her face shut against the whole watching world, braced, as she had braced herself her whole life, for the falling of the blow she was entirely certain was coming. And he found the Duke of Kelmore standing at the forge. The forge fire was up, and had been built up hot on purpose, roaring, the coals gone white at the heart of them, throwing heat across the cold yard. And Rafe Sutcliffe stood before it in his shirt-sleeves, with a single paper held in his hand. And the paper was the deed of consent Hugo's own lawyers had carried down for his signing, the sworn declaration, wanting only the Duke's name at the foot of it, that the marriage had been a hollow sham, never truly meant and never consummated. Without the husband's own hand set to it, the annulment had scarcely a leg to stand on, for the one man in England who could swear the marriage false was the husband himself, and Hugo had staked the whole of his suit on the flat certainty that Rafe would leap at the chance to be rid of his lame wife and sign. "Your Grace," said the king's steward carefully, looking from the Duke to the forge to the cold, straight woman by the door and reading, shrewd man that he was, that he had ridden into the middle of something, "I am come down about the question of the marriage. There is a suit, as I understand it, that says there was never any true marriage here at all, and that the king's mares therefore stand on doubtful ground." "There is such a suit," said Rafe. He did not look at the steward. He looked across the whole watching yard at his wife, at the straight, cold-braced figure of her by the office door, waiting for the blow, as she had waited her whole hard life. "My cousin says there was never a marriage. He says I bought a dying woman on paper to cheat him of an entail, and that I carried her off to a ruin and abandoned her to die there, and never once thought of her again, and that the whole of it was a fraud and a fiction from the first, and ought by rights to be struck clean out of the books." He turned the paper slowly in his hardened, blistered hand, and the firelight ran along the edge of it. "And the shameful part of it, sir, the part my cousin does not trouble to mention, is that every single word of that is true. That is exactly what I did. I married a woman I fully intended to bury, and I left her at a rotting ruin with a purse of nothing, and I did not think of her again for years together. There is not one lie anywhere in my cousin's suit. There is only the single thing my cousin does not know." "And what is that thing, your Grace?" said the steward, very quiet now, for the whole yard had gone still around them. "That I was wrong," said Rafe, "that I was a coward and a cruel man, and wrong to the very bottom of it, and that I am not that man any longer, and have not been for some while, and do not mean ever to be him again, and that this paper here," he lifted it, and every eye in the yard went up with it, "is the very last piece of that man left anywhere in the world, and I am about to be quit of him." And he turned, and he put the deed into the white and roaring heart of the forge fire. It caught at once and flared up bright, and Hugo's lawyer started forward with a strangled cry, and then thought the better of it under the flat cold eye of the king's own steward, and the paper curled and blackened and went up in a single bright scrap of ash that rose spinning on the forge's heat into the grey morning air, and was gone. Rafe watched it burn all the way to nothing. Then he turned his back on the forge and on the king's man, and on the whole of the watching yard, and he crossed the cold ground, slow and steady and certain, to where his wife stood frozen and disbelieving by the office door, and he stopped close in front of her, and he spoke so that every soul in the yard would hear him say it. "There was a marriage," he said. "There is a marriage. I will swear it before you, and before the king's steward here, and before the courts, and before God, and before my cousin, and before any man living who dares to ask me. This is my wife, Adela Sutcliffe, Duchess of Kelmore, and this is her land, and her stud, and her name over the king's own horses, put there by her own hand and her own worth, and I will not sell one nail of it, nor sign one paper against it, nor take one single road that leads away from it, so long as I have breath left in me to refuse. I came down this lane 3 winters ago to bury you and be gone by supper. I have come back down it to stay. There is no summons and no crown and no place at any court on this earth worth one grey morning of standing in this yard beside you, and I have spent 3 years and 1 burning barn learning it, and I am done being taught." Adela looked up at him, and the great wall in her, the wall she had built out of a grave and guarded past all sense and hauled back up in the dark, not a fortnight gone, stood one last moment between the two of them, and every old voice she owned said, "No one stays, no one stays," and she looked into his face, at the terror he had walked through for her and the whole cold, splendid life he had just fed into a forge fire in front of the king's own man, and she found, standing there, that the old voices had at long last simply run out of proof. They had said no one stays, and here, plainly, in front of the whole yard, having burned the road behind him, a man had stayed. "You did not say you were sorry," she said. Her voice was not quite steady, and she did not try to make it so. "No," he said, "I did not. I do not think a word of it would be worth the breath to you, and I do not think you would believe it out of my mouth, and I think you would be right not to. So I have not said it. I burned it instead, where you could see." He looked at her, steady, unhurried, unafraid. "Was I wrong to?" "No," she said. And then, because she was who she was, dry and stubborn and armoured even here, even now, even with the whole of it won, "it draws a great deal better than the house chimneys ever did." And Rafe Sutcliffe laughed, a cracked and astonished sound torn straight up out of him, the very same sound she had made herself in the bloody straw the night the colt first breathed, and it was the laugh of a man who has just been let, against every expectation, to live. And Adela reached up with her free hand and took a fistful of the front of his shirt, the way she took hold of anything at all that she had made up her mind to keep, and she pulled him down to her, and she kissed him, there in the cold grey yard she had built up out of her own open grave, with the ash of his old life still drifting down on the still air around them. It was not a brief kiss, and it was not a dry one, and it was not upon the cheek. It was the kiss of 2 people who have each of them walked into a fire for the other, and come out living on the far side of it, and she did not let him go quickly, and he did not want to be let go, and it went on until it had said, without one word, all the things that 3 years of clipped and practical and guarded speech had left starving in the dark between them. And when at last she drew back, it was only far enough to look at him, and she kept her fist knotted in his shirt, holding him where she had decided he would stay, and he brought his hardened hand up and cupped the side of her weathered face, as though it were the finest and most fragile thing he had ever been let to touch, and neither of them said one further word, because there was, for the first time in the whole of their lives, no longer the smallest need of any. Behind them old Wren had turned away, and was making a great business of his pipe to hide his face, and Pip was crowing outright, and the grooms had broken into a ragged cheer that startled the horses in their boxes, and the king's shrewd steward stood by the roaring forge and watched the 2 of them, and understood, being a shrewd man, that there was no longer any question here of any annulment, nor ever would be again. He wrote to His Majesty that same night that the marriage of Kelmore was as sound and true a thing as ever he had witnessed in his life, sounder by far than most that were got up with settlements and lawyers, and that the royal mares stood on ground held firm and fast by a duke and a duchess both, and that the breeder Adela Sutcliffe was, in his own considered and unhurried judgment, worth more to the bloodstock of England than the whole gilded court of it put end to end. The king, who had always valued a living foal and a thing done well above any question of ceremony or precedence, confirmed the royal stud at Coldharbour, under both their 2 names set down together, and had Hugo Sutcliffe's suit struck from the rolls with a single stroke of the pen, and what exactly His Majesty thought privately of a duke who had let a royal summons to court lie unanswered on a window-sill in favour of gentling yearlings and mucking out a stable, no one at Coldharbour ever heard, and no one at Coldharbour ever thought it worth the trouble to ask. There would be a reckoning of some kind, perhaps, out there in the great world, for a man does not turn his back on a king's favour without some manner of bill falling due at the end of it. It could wait. It could wait, Adela thought, a very long time indeed, and she found she was in no particular hurry to hear the sum of it. They rebuilt the burned barn together that summer, the two of them, board by good board, and Rafe drove the nails himself, and his hands, that had gone through his whole first life without one honest day's labour on them, grew hard and brown and sure at the work. He learned every horse on the place by its name and its temper, and he laid his bare hand at last on every warm neck in the yard, without the old crawl coming up his spine to unman him, and the terror shrank in him season by season, until it was only a scar he wore under his coat, and a scar is a thing a man can carry easily enough through a long life if he has someone to carry it alongside. In the long gold evenings when the day's work was done, the two of them would stand together at the paddock rail and watch the foals run in the low light, the king's fine colts among them, and he would fetch her a cup of water without being asked, and she would lean her weight against him without being ashamed of it, when the hip woke and sang in the damp, and neither of them, having each spent a whole hard lifetime learning to need no living soul, ever quite got over the strangeness of it, nor the sweetness of being at the very last exactly where they were wanted and kept and stayed with. He had come down that lane to seize a worthless ruin, and had found the king's own racehorses stabled under the name of the wife he had thrown away to die, and in the end he did not seize it, and he did not sell it, and he did not ride away from it. He stayed. He called Cold Harbour his home, and he called Adela his wife, and he meant the both of them to the marrow, and he had earned the right to mean them the only way such a right is ever truly earned in this world, which is never by the saying of it, but by the staying to prove it, morning after cold morning, in the mud and the frost and the labour and the gold evening light, for the whole long mended remainder of a life. And that is the story of the lame village midwife, a duke, married to cheat his cousin of an entail, and carried off to a rotting stud farm to die alongside it, who instead turned her healing hands from women to horses, rebuilt a ruined bloodline into the champions of a king, and drew that king's own racehorses under her name, and so forced the very man who had discarded her to learn, board by board and blister by blister, that the strongest things in all this world are never the ones that are seized, or inherited, or commanded from a great height, but the ones that are built, slowly and with aching hands, by those the world was fool enough to bury too soon. If it moved you, if you believe as I do that the ones written off and left in the dark can rise up to hold everything, then give this story your heart and your like, and share it on with someone who needs to be told tonight that it is never, ever too late to refuse the grave that others have dug for you, and subscribe, and ring the bell. Besides, so that the next story finds its own way to you when the nights are long and cold. Until then, remember this. If you remember nothing else, the truest home you will ever have is never the one you are handed. It is the one you build with your own two hands, board by board, out of the ruin they left you in, and then choose, every single morning after, to stay.